land destruction? In 2024? It must be time for some more Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So we're swiftly nearing the end of spoiler season. We get the full set on Friday, but today we actually have a ton of cards to talk about. One of our biggest spoiler days of the entire week, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking spicy new cards. Before we do, a couple quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. And second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGPreviews.com. Oh yeah, it's also Commander Precon Spoiler Day. I'm not going to be talking about these, but Tomer is going to be covering the Commander Precons over on the MTG Goldfish Commander YouTube. So make sure to head over there in a few hours, check out his videos going over all 4 of the new Commander decks. Anyway, let's talk some more Murders at Karlov Manor. So first up today, we get some honest-to-goodness land destruction. Well, sorta. 2024 land destruction in Krenko's Buzzcrusher. So 4-mana 4/4 artifact creature is an Insectopter with flying and trample. When it ETBs, you basically Field of Ruin everyone. For each player, you can destroy one non-basic land that player controls. For each land destroyed this way, its controller can search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tapped, and then shuffle. So Krenko's Buzzcrusher is essentially Obsidian Charmaw, but formatted like Field of Ruin. This is the, safe standard version of the effect, where you don't actually hurt your opponent's feelings by putting them down a land. You just kind of annoy their Triumph a little bit by turning it into a basic land. But honestly, complaints aside, the start is still legitimately good. I think Krenko's Buzzcrusher is one of the cards I'm most hyped about from this set. So even though it's a Field of Ruin, and even though it's going to replace itself, in theory you can build a Ponza deck in Standard with this card. So the trick of Field of Ruin, Demolition Field, Krenko's Buzzcrusher is if you can run your opponent out of basic lands by using these cards enough, then Field of Ruin and Demolition Field turns into a real strip mine. Then Krenko's Buzzcrusher turns into a real upgraded Obsidian Charmaw. So I think it's possible we can make this work. I know a lot of decks in Standard are playing a lot of basic, so it's going to take some effort, and I don't think we're going to have a top-tier Ponza land destruction deck in Standard, but thanks to Buzzcrusher and Field of Ruin and Demolition Field, I think it's possible we can make it work. One place I'm really hyped about this card is in Pioneer Land Destruction. So we played this Pioneer Land Destruction deck a couple weeks ago, and it looks so janky, because your land destruction is mostly Buzzcrusher-style land destruction that's going to replace the land with a basic, like Assassin's Trophy or Dire Strain Rampage. But it turns out that Pioneer players, most of them are super greedy and playing like 2 basics. So combine these cards with Field of Ruins and Demolition Fields, and it's actually pretty easy to play real land destruction in Pioneer. Krenko's Buzzcrusher is absolutely totally perfect for this deck. It'll be one of the best cards possible in the deck. It adds a 4/4 flying trample to the body while also doing what the deck's trying to do. I don't think this card is of much interest once you get back to Modern. Once you get back to Modern, you got Fulminator Mages, Charmaw, Blood Moon. So I think this is a Pioneer and Standard card primarily. I guess you can also play it in Commander where it does hit each opponent and get rid of people's Cabal coffers or whatever. But I think this is mostly a Pioneer and Standard card. One of the sweetest tricks of this card is if you read it closely, it doesn't actually target any lands. When it ETBs, for each player, you just choose a land. And you might be wondering, why does this matter? Choosing, targeting, it's all the same, right? You blow up a land, it goes to the graveyard. This matters in one very specific case, which is Krenko's Buzzcrusher is a card that can blow up Lotus Field. We'll see how much this matters. It is 4 mana. Is that fast enough to be real hate against Lotus Field combo decks in formats like Pioneer? We'll have to wait and see if it's fast enough, but it's certainly notable that this card, because of the lack of the word target, can actually blow up hexproof lands like Lotus Field. So Krenko's Buzzcrusher, the card's really good. I think this card has Standard potential, is certainly has Pioneer potential. That's the format I'm most hyped about this card, is I think this seems like a really, really good Pioneer card, and it's formatted in a way, of course, that works in Commander as well, where it could be worth running in Commander, especially if you have artifact synergies or whatever. Next up, we get some wonky green card draw in Audience with Trostani. So 3-mana sorcery says create a 0/1 green plant creature token, then draw a card cards equal to the number of differently named creature tokens you control. So if you think about this card, by itself, 3 mana, you make a 0/1 plant, you draw a single card. But really, if you're playing a deck with tokens, I think this card's actually pretty strong, right? You only need 1 non-plant creature token on the battlefield to turn this into a divination, which isn't exciting, but not bad. If you have 2 different non-plant creature tokens on the battlefield, then you turn it into Painful Truce that doesn't lose you life, which then you're kind of cooking. Like 3 mana draw 3s are very good even in Commander, and then you have this really high upside where in the late game with a huge board full of differently named tokens, this can be a Return to the Wild Speaker that's just like refilling your hand and drawing you a ton of cards. So I think this card could maybe have a chance in Standard. Tokens is one of those archetypes that I've got burned by a lot of times in this Standard. We got Jetmir, we got Jinny Fae, we have all these good payoffs for tokens, but in a world of Sunfalls and Farewells and Infinite Wrath, they just really haven't worked. But Audience with Trostani, there's plenty of pieces to make a token deck. Wedding Announcement, Adelaine, Huntsman's Redemption, Might tokens, Incubate tokens, Micro Tyrant tokens. There's so many tokens, so it's very possible to build a Standard deck around this card. It doesn't really solve the problems, I think, of tokens, which is the wraths are just so pushed that it really punishes go wide decks in Standard, but you could draw a lot of cards with this card. Also works with making tokens of creatures, copies of those creatures, like Doppelganger C-Double. This is a way you can have a token that's named Sheoldred or Atraxa, which is a good way to up the names of your tokens. So keep that in mind as well. It doesn't just work with things that are just straight up create a token, it works with these token copying effects as well. One thing I did want to point out about this card, how it actually works. So look at Kessig Wolf Riders and Tovolar's Huntmaster, 2 cards that are currently in Standard. Wolf Rider makes a 3/2 red wolf creature token. Tovolar's Huntmaster makes a 2/2 green wolf creature token, but the name of both of these cards is just wolf. That's how token naming works. So as far as Audience with Trostani is concerned, you can have the 3/2 red wolf and a 2/2 green wolf. That's only going to count as 1 for Audience of Trostani because the name of those 2 cards are the same. So keep that in mind as you're building around this card. All that really matters is the name and having a bunch of different ones. As far as Commander is concerned, to me, this feels like a Commander deck staple. So for me, in Commander, 3 mana draw 3s are really good. Some of my favorite cards, Painful Truce style effects, Secret Rendezvous style effects, 3 mana draw 3s, really good source of card advantage. And in a token deck, some sort of like Jetmir, Trostani, Essex, Gyrid, Reese, Bernard, it should be pretty easy for that to be attainable pretty regularly. Yes, it's not going to be great off the top after a Wrath or whatever, but I think more often than not, this is at least going to be a 3 mana draw 3 in green, and that's good enough for me to play this in pretty much any token deck as card advantage. And then you get the upside, of course, where this is sometimes going to draw 5 cards or 7 cards or 10 cards, and it's going to be absolutely absurd. So Audience with Trostani, really solid card draw for a token deck. Still a little concerned that tokens might not make it in Standard, because I feel like every set, I'm like, okay, Urborglyph, this is the set, and it doesn't work. Tokens, this is the set, and it still doesn't work. So I'm still a little skeptical about tokens actually taking off, but that's not because this card is bad. It's actually really good. We also got some wild blue hate/reanimation and Reenact the Crime. So 4 mana, including 3 blue for an instant. This says exile target non-land card in a graveyard that was put there from anywhere this turn. Copy it, and you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So the first thing I thought of with this card is, this is kind of like a C-Double. C-Double is a ridiculously strong card. It is so good. You can be copying an Atraxa, and maybe if your graveyard's full, copying something on the battlefield as well. The only downside to C-Double is it's 4 mana instant speed, so it requires you to leave up a lot of mana, which isn't always attainable. It's really risky to leave up 4 mana instead of like adding to the board, because if you don't get a chance to use your C-Double or your Reenact the Crime, then you're going to lose a ton of tempo and maybe the game as well. So really, really strong card, probably way stronger than C-Double actually, but you're going to have to find a way to actually be able to play it. So obviously the dream with this card is you're playing Standard, your opponent's like, okay, big score, I'm going to reanimate this Atraxa, pitch my Atraxa, and you're just like, no, Reenact the Crime, Atraxa, exile it, I'll get a copy of it, I'll draw the cards, GG. And that is going to happen. Like, that is a real line that will come up in the standard format. So I think that's the dream. So that's one of the dreams, but there's other dreams as well. You can use this on yourself in a self-mill deck where you're like, I'm going to Tome Scour, try to hit Omniscience, reenact the crime of the Omniscience, go on to like combo off, win the game or whatever. Also, Absurd with Entomb. This is essentially a 2-card combo. Like, if you're playing a commander deck and you have Entomb and you're in blue, this might be worth it because Entomb lets you search your library for any card and put it in the graveyard for 1 mana instant speed. And then Reenact the Crime can just let you cast that card. The unique part about Reenact the Crime as well is it works with spells too. Like, normally Entomb is getting some big creature to reanimate, but with Reenact the Crime, you could be getting a ultimatum. You can get an Omniscience, a big enchantment, a big planeswalker. It does not matter. You're going to be able to copy it as long as it's not a land for just 4 mana and instant speed. It also works with stuff like Emrakul. The hilarious dream is you like Entomb and Emrakul with the shuffle trigger on the stack. You Reenact the Crime, get the Emrakul, and you do this all at instant speed because they're both instant. So the card is super, super good. As I was talking about before, though, in standard and specific, where do you play this card? Leaving up 4 mana is so risky, and I think the answer is decks that have other instant speed stuff, like Make Disappear, Wandering Emperor, Fury Mastermind, that really reduces the risk of playing this card. When your options are okay, I can Reenact the Crime if I get a good opportunity. Otherwise, I'll flash in my Wandering Emperor, or I'll flash in my Fury Mastermind, or I'll Make Disappear something. That really reduces the downside, the C-double problem of needing to leave up such a big amount of mana. So I think that's the most obvious home outside of like self-mill combo decks where you're trying to set up this big thing with your own deck. If you're playing this fairly quote unquote, it's probably going to be in some sort of draw go style deck where you're leaving up your mana for other things anyway. And this is either just an additional threat in your main deck or maybe a sideboard card that you bring in for certain graveyard matchups. In Commander, I think you can play this in pretty much any Reanimator style deck that's in its colors. It is worth keeping in mind there is a timing restriction, right? You only get the card that was put to the graveyard from anywhere this turn, but it has to be this turn. So you can't like buried alive some stuff in the graveyard, ship the turn, the next turn Reenact the Crime like you could with a real reanimation spell. But you get so much upside out of this, being able to target any graveyard and doing it at instant speed and being able to hit spells as well as creatures, that I think that's still fine. So if you're playing some sort of graveyardy self-mill Reanimator deck, I think this is worth playing because sometimes you're going to get value out of your own deck. Other times you're just going to be able to like steal something busted from your opponent. Your opponent Cyclonic Rifts and you're like, you know what, that seems pretty good. Maybe I'll just Cyclonic Rift you back. Or your opponent casts an ultimatum and you're like, you know what, I would like one of those too. So it's kind of like a weird spell copying effect that has all this different upside on top of it. So Reenact the Crime, I think this card's actually like really strong. I don't want to say busted. I don't think it's busted because it is 4 mana. It is triple blue. The tempo issue is there, but this card can do some absolutely ridiculous things that few cards in Magic have ever even thought of doing. Next on the list, we got Illicit Masquerade, and shout out to this art. One of my favorite pieces of art from the set. So a 4 mana black enchantment with flash. When it enters a battlefield, you put a counterfeit counter on each creature you control, and then when a creature you control with a counterfeit counter on it dies, exile it and return up to 1 other target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this card is really weird, right? So level 1, this is sort of a body snatcher for all your creatures. Like if you have a big board of creatures, you flash this in, they all get the counterfeit counter. When they die, you should get value out of it by being able to reanimate something else. I think the level 1 of this card is essentially being a black wrath protection spell. So green has heroic intervention, white has a bunch of indestructible stuff like flawless maneuver, blue gets to phase stuff out. This seems like the black version of the effect where you're playing your commander game, someone casts their damnation or their wrath of God or their blasphemous act, and you flash this in, put the counters on all your stuff, and your stuff dies, and you're like, okay, that's fine. I'm gonna get stuff back from the graveyard. There is a downside to this plan, which is you do need a bunch of stuff in the graveyard. Heroic intervention, flawless maneuver, march of swirling mist, all these cards just save what's on the battlefield. Illicit Masquerade, the drawback is if your graveyard's empty, it's not gonna save your current board. The upside is though, you can be like trading up your creatures in response to a wrath. Imagine Your opponent like goes to wrath your board, you got a Blood Tithe Harvester, you flash this in, put the counterfeit counter on the Blood Tithe Harvester, and when it dies you get a Troxa, or even just a Sheoldred. That's better than saving your Blood Tithe Harvester. Like, that's a huge upgrade. So there is huge upside here. It's like a risky creature board protection Wrath Hate style spell. I think it's pretty good in Commander, where you can play this in graveyard-based decks. That gets around the problem we were just talking about of it doesn't do anything unless you got a graveyard full of creatures, but if you're playing Sidisi or Madroltha, some sort of self-mill graveyard deck, that shouldn't be a problem. Then this is amazing Wrath protection in those decks. You can also try to combo with it, like make a bunch of tokens with Zet's Will or Carrion or Empty the Pits, like go super wide, put the counterfeit counters on all of them, then you cast a Blasphemous Act and turn it into this weird like combo-y Rise of the Dark Realms almost, where you're reanimating your whole graveyard of huge threats to take over the game. So you could build around it in that way. I think it's also going to be really good in some sack style decks. So that's the other way to take advantage of this card, is using it like some sort of sack combo piece in like a sack reanimator deck like Carmen or Cruxin Kunros, Jury Master of Review, where you're planning on sacking your creatures for value anyway. So you play this, get the counters on some low value creatures, and then turn them into higher value creatures. Just keep in mind, there is a little bit of a drawback here. When the creature with the confetti counter dies, it's going to go to exile, so you're losing that thing forever. So just keep that in mind. If like looping a Cauldron Familiar is an essential part to your plan, you probably don't want the confetti counter on it, because then it's going to go to exile and you're not going to be able to keep using it. But I think that Illicit Masquerade is actually very strong. Also works with the Ozolith in a weird way. Like when your creatures with confetti counters die, the counters will go on the Ozolith, and then you can put those counters on another creature on your next combat phase. So that's how we can keep getting value out of this, because one of the awkward parts about this is it's normally going to run out, right? You play this, your board gets wrath, you have nothing left with counterfeit counters, but you still have the Illicit Masquerade, so Ozolith helps you get a little extra value out of it. So Illicit Masquerade, it's a cool design. I really like this card. I'm going to say I think it's more like mid-powered than busted, but it's cool to see black getting this Wrath protection style effect, and there is some cool build-around potential as well. We also got Improbable Explosion, which I think probably describes its chance of really being that good in 60 card Magic. Improbable. 4 mana sorcery. Is it? Draw 2 cards. Then you may discard 2 cards. When you do, it deals X damage to each creature, where X is the highest mana value among the discarded cards. So this is very strange to me. So the way this is worded, you cast it and draw 2 cards. Then you may discard 2 cards. But then if you do decide to discard 2 cards, you only get damage equal to the highest mana value of those 2. So it's this weird all or nothing thing, right? Where you draw 2, then you either discard 2 or you discard 0. It would be interesting if you discard like up to 2 and just discard 1 big card. But I guess if you want to try to get the Wrath mode out of it, you got to pay the price of discarding 2 cards. So it's kind of like Faithless Looting mixed with a Wrath of God. When things go well, fingers crossed it'll be a Wrath of God. We've seen Draconic Intervention. This was a card I was kind of hyped about not that long ago in Strixhaven, which is a little similar. Like, it needs a big spell in your graveyard and it turns into a 4-mana Wrath, but it turned out it just wasn't really good enough and never really saw any play. So I'm worried about the consistency issue with Improbable Explosion. Yes, when it works, it's going to be great. When it works, it's Faithless Looting that wraths the board. You're super happy, but there's going to be times when it doesn't work, where you don't have a high mana value card in your hand, or when you don't want to discard your high mana value card. And then this is pretty bad. If this is just 4 mana draw 2, that is like way below the curve. So you got to be getting the Wrath mode out of it pretty consistently if you're going to be playing this card. There are some potential homes for it though. Some decks want to be filling the graveyard. Again, going back to Atraxa, maybe you're trying to reanimate Atraxa in Standard. You can Improbable Explosion, pitch your Atraxa, sweep the board, next turn reanimate it. Or in Pioneer, there's like the Magma Opus Torrential Gearhulk decks, where you're pitching big spells like Magma Opus anyway. This could sweep the board, get the Magma Opus in the graveyard, flash it back with Torrential Gearhulk and win the game. There's also some like jank combo potential, so if you have a super high mana value card, this is a really cheap way to deal a lot of damage to each creature. So if you're trying to go off with Stuffy Dolls or Brash Taunters, and you can get a Blink Maw Yawgmoth Infusion in hand, or Scion of Draco. This is for 4 mana, dealing 12 or 14 damage to your Stuffy Dells and Taunters that are then redirecting that damage to your opponent, so you can try to build around it like that. Remember, Starve Extinction is 7 mana for 20 damage to each creature. This is 4 mana though, so you can't quite get it all the way up to 20 damage, but 4 mana to deal 14 damage to everything, super good with Stuffy Doll effects. As far as the competitive play though, the comparisons just aren't great. We already talked about Draconic Intervention not making it. Storm's Wrath exists. That's just clean 4 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. No one really plays it, so I think Improbable Explosion might share the same fate. If it's gonna work, maybe like Pioneer Arclight Phoenix, where you got Treasure Cruises, Temporal Trespasses, you want to be pitching your Arclight Phoenixes anyway, but still, I'm not convinced that you wouldn't just play a more consistent option rather than Improbable Explosion. I think the exception would be in Commander. Seems really good in a Real, where you just really want to be discarding cards. This is like a Wrath that works with your Commander. Also could work in like Sauron Lord of the Rings, another reanimation style commander deck that's going to be full of really expensive things, wanting to be filling the graveyard. Those are the kind of homes where it can work. So Improbable Explosion, the card's cute. I hope it's good, but I'm a little skeptical based on other cards from the past that look kind of similar and just didn't really make it in 60 card formats. We also got some more Molgot action in Anzrag's Rampage. So 5 mana sorcery says destroy all artifacts you don't control, then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts that were put in the graveyard from the battlefield this turn. You may put a creature card exiled this way on the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to your hand at the beginning of your next end step. So Anzrag's Rampage, this card is kind of wild, right? So it's Vandal Blast. Vandal Blast Overloaded is 5 mana to destroy all your opponent's artifacts. That is already one of the most played red cards in Commander, like an ultra staple in red decks in Commander. But this is way better because you're getting Vandal Blast, but you're also getting a Summoning Trap style effect where you're getting to cheat some big creature into play from your deck. So I think this card, at a minimum, is a new Commander All-Star. If you were playing Vandal Blast, I think you just play this instead. Sure, I guess Vandal Blast, you get the upside that maybe you sometimes cast it for 1 mana, but normally you're not doing that unless you're desperate. So I think that this is Overloaded Vandal Blast plus Summoning Trap, new Commander All-Star for red decks. As far as 6 card formats are concerned, this card has one really big problem, right? It doesn't do anything unless your opponent has a bunch of artifacts. In Commander, it doesn't matter because everyone's playing Mana Rock, so even if there's no artifact deck at the table, you're probably going to be blowing up 5, 6, 7 things, which is perfectly fine, especially when you're getting a creature out of the deal. In Standard or Modern or Pioneer, it's just very matchup dependent. So if we end up in a meta where there's a bunch of Surge Injure artifact decks in Standard, or everyone's got a million clues on the battlefield, which is kind of possible, or you're playing against Affinity style decks all the time, then this is a great sideboard option, but it's just so narrow that I don't think you can main deck this. Also worth keeping in mind, we get all these trinket tokens, treasures, bloods, clues. Many of those can be sacked with a spell on the stack, so this isn't actually that good against treasures in specific. If your opponent like Docksides and has a million treasures, they'll just sack them all, so you don't get a huge creature with Anzrag's Rampage. But still, even with that in mind, Vandal Blast with huge upside, easy Commander staple, impossible sideboard card for 60 card formats. We also got Worldsouls Rage. So this is kind of a weird one. Grow mana in X, so green, red, and X for a sorcery that deals X damage to any target, and you can put X land cards from your hand and or graveyard on the battlefield tapped. So this card is kind of wild. It starts off as bad removal / burn, like it's a volcanic geyser essentially. Double mana and then X means to deal a single damage you need 3 mana, 2 damage, 4 mana. It scales very slowly, so this is not a good removal spell period, not a good removal spell in the early game, but if you have a ton of mana, it can deal a ton of damage and close out the game. The exciting part is the ramp part of this card, especially the fact that it lets you put lands not just from your hand, but also your graveyard into play. So it's kind of like Renan's 7/0 ability, a little bit like a mini Splendid Reclamation. If you're casting this for 3, 4, 5 mana, this could be ramping you a ton. So the card works really well with fetch lands. lands. I think that's the asterisk of all this. So putting lands into play from your hand is great. The problem is, by the time you're casting this for, let's say, 4 mana or 5 mana, you're probably not going to have 2 or 3 extra lands left in your hand. That seems kind of unlikely. So the fact that you can get cards from your graveyard is really important to making this card work. And the easiest way to get lands in your graveyard is just play fetch lands. So Cabretti Courtyards and the Streets of New Capenna fetch lands in Standard, real fetch lands in other formats. So when we talk about this card, I'm going to be assuming that you have a plan to get lands in your graveyard. If you can get lands in your graveyard, this is actually a really good ramp spell. So if you think about how it scales Ramp Rise, at 3 mana, Topiary Stomp, you ramp 1 land. At 4 mana, Explosive Vegetation, you ramp 2 lands. At 6 mana, you essentially open the ways and ramp 4 lands. That is off the charts. That's so strong. So again, there's a hoop to jump through. You got to have fetches in your graveyard. You got to be self-milling or have a ton of lands in hand somehow. But if you can do this, this actually scales really well ramp-wise. So I don't really think about this as like a removal spell because it's really bad as removal. That's kind of the nice backup mode that in the late game, if you ramp enough, this can be your finisher, or maybe sometimes you get to kill a little creature with it. But just being able to put 2, 3, 4 extra lands on the battlefield, that's the true value of Worldsouls Rage. Speaking of souls, in Standard, really good with Soul of Windgrace, Blossoming Tortoise. We've seen a little bit of this Jund land in the graveyard deck that's often playing fetch lands, pretty good at filling the graveyard. Worldsouls Rage seems like a perfect fit there. This is a great ramp spell in the late game, and it's also sweet that if you ramp enough, the damage that it deals, even though it's not especially efficient, can be enough to close out the game. As far as Commander is concerned, I think there's 2 possibilities. One is, seems sweet in landfall decks. So in landfall decks, you're probably going to have lands in your graveyard because you're going to want a bunch of fetches anyway. The landfall decks are the decks in Commander that'll actually play like Evolving Wilds with a straight face, the Mirage fetches with a straight face, because getting 2 lands instead of 1 with your land drop is just so good with landfall. So you're going to have the fetches, and then this is trigger your landfall stuff a ridiculous amount of times. This is just going to be putting so many lands into play. So if you're playing Omnath or Oban or Phaleth, then I think this is a nice inclusion there. Also seems really good in decks that are all about getting lands in the graveyard, Lord Windgrace or Hazan Shaper of Sands. These decks are really good at sacking lands, getting them in and out of the graveyard. Worldsouls Rage seems like an easy inclusion there as well. Could also maybe see play as a way to like protect an important land. I think there's probably better ways of doing this in general, but some decks really need their Dark Depths or their Tron lands or their Field of the Dead. This is a way you can snipe a little creature and get back a Field of the Dead that got strip mined, or a Dark Depths that got wastelanded, an Urza's Tower that you milled over. So Worldsouls Rage, I actually really like this card. This is not a card that you can just jam in any deck and get value, but in the right deck, a deck that can fill their graveyard or maybe even their hand with lands, this can be a really absurd ramp spell and even a finisher. I can imagine one of the things I like about this is it's kind of like Splendid Reclamation. We talked about that before, where it's a way you can put a bunch of lands into play, but it's also a finisher for a Splendid Reclamation deck. If you like Splendid Reclamation, all your lands from your graveyard into play, then you can just be like, all right, Worldsouls Rage you with all my mana, like hopefully burn you out of the game. So not a card for every deck, but in the right deck, Worldsouls Rage seems like a legit bob. Moving on to the world of lower rarity cards, and we're gonna go lightning mode through these because there's actually a bunch I wanted to mention, but I gotta shout these cards out because one of my favorite parts of this set and of recent Magic design is WotC just powering up uncommons and making them into really sweet, interesting playable cards. And we got several of those today. So Vengeful Tracker, 2-mana 2/2 human detective. When an opponent sacks an artifact, it deals 2 damage to them. So if you're tired of Dockside Extortionist in Commander, if you're tired of losing to your friend's Lannis deck, Vengeful Tracker makes it really hard to crack your treasures or your clues or any of your other trinket tokens. So really good against those tokens. I think there's also like some outside shot that it could show up in Constructed in very specific matchups. Like it's really good against Arcbound Ravager decks that are all about sacking artifacts. It's pretty good against Cauldron Familiar, repeatedly sacking food tokens. So maybe it could show up as a sideboard card for those matchups. We also got Breakout, which is really wild. So 2-mana Gruul Sorcery. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them. If the card has mana value 2 or less, you can put it on the battlefield and it gains haste until end of turn. If you didn't put it on the battlefield, put it in your hand. The rest go on the bottom in a random order. So Breakout is intriguing because of that. Put a creature mana value 2 or less into play. I'm imagining this to be a card for prowess decks where you want as many creatures with prowess as possible, but you also need a ton of spells to trigger those creatures and grow them. Breakout is essentially a Monastery Sphere, a Kenra Spell Spear or whatever, that also is going to trigger all your prowess stuff on the battlefield. So I think in some sort of Gruul prowess Spellslinger style deck, this is actually really good if you can find room for it, because it's essentially a spell that is also one of the creatures that's in your deck, which is exactly what prowess would want. Could also maybe do something with Burning Tree Emissary. That was the other thing, like some sort of Gruul aggro Burning Tree Emissary. This digs for your burning trees, you get free mana, you go off and win the game. So Breakout, I think, certainly has the look of a constructed playable uncommon. We also got Soul Enervation. So 4 mana flash black enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn. Not very good as removal, doesn't even kill Shieldred. But whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. It's that last ability that is intriguing to me. So what this means in practice is, like, you play this, you play your Lion Sash, and every time you eat a creature from your graveyard, you drain for 1. I don't know if it'd actually be competitive, but it is something you could build around in some sort of self-mill deck where maybe this is a finisher. Obviously, I think the idea of this is to work with the collect evidence mechanic, although I think it's actually pretty bad with collecting evidence. The problem with collecting evidence is this triggers when one or more creatures leave your graveyard, and collect evidence is exiling cards in big chunks based on their mana value, so you can exile 5 cards to equal 10 mana value to collect evidence, and you're only draining for 1. So it's much better with creatures repeatedly leaving your graveyard over and over again. Also a finisher for like Gravecrawler combo loops. I don't know if Gravecrawler combo loops actually need another finisher, but this does get the job done. We also got Flotsam and Jetsam, which I want to mention just because Jetsam reads like a ridiculous commander card to me. So 6 mana, including 2 Dimir hybrid. Each opponent mills 3 cards. Then you may cast a spell from each opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a spell would be put into a graveyard this way, it goes to exile instead. The other side, mill some cards, investigate, whatever. Jetsam, though, to me seems ridiculous. So let's think about this. For 6 mana, you mill each opponent for 3, and then you get to cast the best spell. And this doesn't say instant or sorcery spell, anything like that. You can cast creatures, artifacts, enchantments, you name it, everything's a spell when it's going on the stack. So you can cast the best thing from each opponent's graveyard, and it's not even from the cards milled. It's not from the 3 cards you milled from each player. It's from any cards in their graveyard. So you're essentially casting a spell for each opponent. So 3 spells for free for 6 mana. So if you're playing some sort of mill deck or some sort of deck that's getting cards into your opponent's graveyard, this seems like a ridiculous finisher. You're essentially paying 2 mana for each spell and you're getting the best spell from your opponent's graveyard. So I think this might just be like busted in Commander, to the point where obviously it's great in a mill deck, but it might just be great in general. In the late game, graveyards get full. This mills a few cards on its own. I could see this just being a really sweet finisher for some sort of thievings play your spell style deck. We also got Insidious Roots, a wild Golgari enchantment. So 2 mana, says creature tokens you control have tapped to add 1 mana of any color, and then when 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 plant creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. So this is kind of like Gahira. Actually, it's not as good as Gahira. Gahira lets all your tokens tap for a mana, which means it works with like clues and treasures and everything. That's what makes it so strong. Insidious Roots only works with creature tokens, so really it's like Cryptolith Rites for creature tokens, which is still a powerful effect. Part of the power of token making is tokens are really cheap. You can flood the board with them very, very easily. When all of them are making mana, you can do some crazy things, and then you also get like a Desecrated Tomb effect. It wasn't that long ago, M19, the Desecrated Tomb was more mana and it rare, and this is like doing so much more, and it's only an uncommon. The uncommons in this set are so good, so maybe we could build a deck with both of these cards for some redundancy, and then do the Gravecrawler loops or exile stuff from our graveyard to get it to go off. It also works with Soul Enervation. Again, I don't know if Soul Enervation really gonna make it, but it seems like it could be a fun budget deck in Standard at least, right? Some sort of keep exiling the stuff from my own graveyard, keep collecting evidence, and use these cards to win the game. We also got Fae Flight, which is another just like really good uncommon. 2 mana, aura, it has flash, it enchants a creature. When it enters the battlefield, enchanted creature gets hexproof until end of turn, and the creature gets +1/+0 when it has flying. So this is kind of combining together Arcane Flight with Cradle of Safety. Basically, if you want an enchantment that gives a thing hexproof until end of turn, this is the new best version of this effect. It's giving the creature flying as well, which is a really nice bonus. So a nicely upgraded Cradle of Safety. We'll see if that's enough to matter. Could be relevant in some sort of Illuminator Virtuoso deck. These decks are kind of hanging out below the surface in Standard. If you play Best of One Standard at all, you've probably died to a huge Illuminator Virtuoso one-shotting you after your opponent cast a bunch of spells on it. Fae Flight seems perfect for that. It protects the Virtuoso and it sends it to the air to make sure it gets in lethal damage. So again, not like some crazy card that's going to define the meta, but certainly a card that is pushed enough to be constructed playable. Of course, we also got a bunch of draft chef filler style stuff that you can find over at MTGPreviews.com. Oh yeah, it's also Commander Precon Preview Day. So we saw these cards before, the face cards of the Commander decks. We're not going to get into them here, but I did want to mention them. So all the decks are coming out today, and over the next couple days, Tomer on the MTGGoldfish Commander channel is going to be going over each and every one of the decks, going over the spoilers. So if you're excited about Cross or Mirko or Morska or Nellyborka, definitely head over to the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube later today and check out Tomer's analysis of these decks. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers for today. So let me know what you think. This set looks so wild. I will say, so we're getting near the end of spoiler season. Technically full set on Friday. I don't know if we actually get any more spoilers between now and then. We're very, very close to the full set of rares and mythics being spoiled for the main set. But I will say, heading into the spoiler season, I'm always hyped about new Magic cards, but for me, I was probably like a 5 out of 10 hype for this set. I think Ravnica Murder Mystery is just kind of like, okay, I know, it's fine. I always like new Magic cards, but this one isn't like speaking to me personally or anything. But I will say my hype level has been increasing day by day through spoiler season as I see these cards with the super cool mechanics, the really pushed uncommons. It seems like a really, really solid set. So my hype level, it's not quite a 10, but I think it's went from like a 5 up to a solid like 7.5 or 8 or something throughout spoiler season, and it could go even higher once we actually get to start playing with the cards, which we will start doing as soon as they come out. So anyway, that's our daily spoilers for today. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back either tomorrow or Friday, depending on how many spoilers we get tomorrow, with one more dose of daily Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against the Odds, where we tried to combo off with Intruder Alarm in Timeless.